Okay, well, maybe we'll get started even if we get a few latecomers coming in. Thanks everybody for coming to this first meeting of the reading group for the minor gesture. I wanted to start by, I'm going to start by reading a small text, essentially the opening out loud. Then we'll do introductions. And then Erin can talk a little bit about where the project came from a little bit and you know, whatever you have interest. I'm sure you're going to have something interesting to say about it. So there's something about writing books that is out of time, as though the writing only really knows what it's after once it has begun to make its way into the world. For me, thinking too has always had this quality. Thinking thickens in its encounter with the futurity that orients it. This futurity in thinking's presentness is part of what keeps thinking lithe. Thinking is always out of sync with itself. The best kind of encounter with thinking's outside is the kind that deeply listens to what writing is trying to do, almost thinking beyond what the author is capable of thinking, then returning that thinking, almost beyond what the reader can think, to the author. In this gesture of encounter, no one is trying to convince anyone. Thought is thinking collectively at its limit. Bringing thought into contact with its limit this way is a minor gesture. It is a minor gesture in that it activates a tendency already in germ and emboldens it towards an altering of what that tendency can do. A thought less concerned with the certainty of what it knows is more open to the minor in thinking, more open to the force of the as yet unformed coursing through it. This minor tendency values the force of form, not just the form knowledge takes. So those are excerpts from the opening paragraphs of the preface, which if you have read the book, already contain in those few words many of the arguments that Erin is presenting. And so I thought it was a very clever way to introduce the book, because it sounds like it's just introducing some stuff about the book, but in fact, a lot of the issues are already there in the text. So at this point, I'd like to go through and just check in with everybody. I want everybody to introduce themselves, who you are, what your interest in the book is, and maybe where you're located, because people are coming in from different locations. Do you want to start, Pat?
Okay, I'm Pat McKeever, and I'm very interested in Erin's first book and in the second book. Why? I could tell a long story, but the short one would be that I'm very interested in all kinds of interstitial spaces, the spaces between things, and movement and the brain and the body are of great interest to me. I am less interested in having a global perspective or an even multi-universal perspective. I like to think about the body or the group of bodies. My Ph.D. is in sociology, but I have moved very close to the humanities in recent years. Is that enough, Jeff?
Sure, that's a good start. Hannah, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and in my research, what I'm looking at is how racialized autistic children become reproduced through their diagnostic encounters, and also looking at how they exceed those, reproductions. So I'm drawing. I started to look at Deleuze and Sarah Ahmed, and certainly Erin Manning's work has been influential in my recent reading. So yeah, that's the direction I'm going in my research.
That sounds super. Cora, do you want to? You're arranged on my screen in a grid, so I'm following the grid, I'm afraid.
Hi, I'm Cora. I think I'm listed there as Cora Lee, but Cora is absolutely fine and more familiar, I think, with all of us. I'm in Toronto. I am a former dancer, and I am now an assistant professor in the School of Nursing at Ryerson. I encountered Pat McKeever and Geoffrey very fortunately in my life when I started my PhD, and really it was the two of them that allowed me to bring my understanding of my person as a dancer into my work as a nurse and working with children with disabilities. And we got to a point in the dissertation where I found myself at a loss, really, in trying to acknowledge both of those people and how I was understanding what I was seeing in terms of children's movement. And it was your work, Erin, really, that helped turn the corner for us and for me personally in being able to rethink and begin to sense the children and their movement in a different way. I really appreciate at the end of your preface, you say you have taught me that we never write alone, and you were speaking to Brian. And I think during that time, during my dissertation, that I did feel like I was writing with you. And I said to Geoffrey this morning, I felt quite emotional in meeting you today. So it's a pleasure. I find myself finding stuck again in certain places now in my current environment and work, especially coming, working within an environment of science and nursing, where I'm trying to bring these ideas and my writing and my desire to see children in a particular way back into this particular environment that I'm working in now.
Great. So Cora is the reason we're all here, because she was the one who said to me, I want to read the minor gesture. And I said, well, we should organize a reading group. So here we are. Doug, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I've said before on the Infinite Conversation site that I see myself as an undercover agent. On the outside, I'm white, male, middle class, but I do not consider myself any of those to a certain extent. So I want this conversation for me to be an exploration of who I really am outside of my body. I live in Kentucky, and that's considered part of the American South. So I'm, in reference to the undercover agent there, I feel like I'm a cell within a strange world in a certain sense, that I don't necessarily have the same views as anyone around me. So yeah, in this conversation, I hope we can kind of reach a level of just mutual understanding, kind of a communal, like a deliberate deliverance of our ideas. So I hope, yeah, I think that's good enough there. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Jocelyn?
I'm sorry. Well, first of all, I would like to apologize for my English accent and my English altogether. And well, I am in Quebec. I'm working with Geoffrey. I'm lucky to be with the series. And well, I'm very interested in this session books. I used to work on the movement when I was a student at Paris. I was following the work of Berthoz on the movement, and I worked on the how we can induce a movement into an electronic system, and it never worked really well. So the book that Geoffrey presented to me was amazing, and not in one way, in many ways. First of all, because he's talking about people who are not the majority, which is really important to me, and you are from Kentucky. I lived there for a couple of years, so I know very well how is it there. And I would say, like, I understand you 100% in what you said. The book is really an opening, and also it, for me, is a change of paradigms. And this way is not only just a word of saying, well, we switch paradigms and we will see how we can induce knowledge about that. It's really more than that. It's really taking the consciousness that we are not only a box and gender differentiation, and we are like all together thinking differently, but at the same time all united. And I think that this book is at the same time showing one direction and opening so much for, at least for me. So I'm really grateful for this, I mean, for Geoffrey to show me this. So thank you, and well, thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. John, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. I read other works by Erin. The one with Brian Masumi, I think that was the one I read, and really enjoyed writing and the style. And my personal experience, I don't know if I'm neurotypical, but I'm definitely a deviant. When I was about 12 years old, I had an accident playing football, and I was paralyzed in my right leg, and I had to wear a back brace for 3 years. And as difficult as that was, it was actually a blessing because it freed me from having to play football and do the sort of masculine kind of things that boys my age were supposed to be interested in. So I ended up reading a great deal. And I would not take my pain medication, which they told me to take if I felt any pain, because it fogged me up, so I couldn't read. So reading became my way of managing pain, because I was able to go into other worlds. So, and as a boy was finding out I was gay or becoming gay, I started to orient myself to reading things that were way over my head, and the sociology and the psychology and Freud and all that. I realized these are the experts, right? But they're wrong. They don't know what this is, because they pathologized it. So I started to realize, though, as I was reading this chapter and thinking about being in the in-between, how becoming or being gay was never a problem that I needed to solve. It was always much more something ineffable, that I knew I had to find a way of finding others who shared this ineffability, these claims about ineffability. And then, you know, there are the out-of-body experiences, the lucid dreams. Maybe I am a little neuroatypical, but trying to put these into a vocabulary that other people, that was communicable has been an ongoing challenge. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share my oddness and my weirdness, and also to make that part of the ecology of practice, is just to accept that. Because I think the more we accept that and come to terms with the responsibility, the more effective we can be in these collaborative learning initiatives, and how these movements, these social movements, become coherent. And I think that the minor gesture is so important to pay attention to. Otherwise, we get wrapped up in trying to promote a cause that actually fits into the norms, or promotes the status quo, rather than that which was ineffable and quite mysterious. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, John. Juan, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hello, first of all. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a PhD student from Geoffrey and Jocelyn at Université Laval here in Quebec. The past couple of years, I've been trying to study and understand human natural productions, like somebody playing the music, a violin or a guitar, and movement and gesture. and trying to understand that is different for each person on what they're doing and trying to create something out of it. We've been working a lot on trying to apply that with technology into real world applications. We made some work in a video game which tried to extract, using artificial intelligence, that singularity as much as we can capture of it, which is not a lot yet for the technology, and doing something creative for people. In this small game we developed, people were able to play the violin and create out of their singularity some trees and some plants. So right now we're working with movement and gesture, and we try to capture again some kind of singularity, well, I guess something minor that is not visible like that just with the technology, and try to apply it into a real world application. That's why I'm really interested in this book. And also I'm trying to find some inspiration for writing my PhD. So thank you.
Super, Juan. Marco?
Hi. This is a weird moment for me because I've been organizing these reading groups on infinite conversations and metapsychosis and these various projects for a few years now. And this is the first time I feel that I'm not in the organizer role, and very self-consciously playing a different role and feeling what that feels like. And so the minor gesture is a, it's an particularly, I think, apt concept for me to encounter right now, because part of my aesthetic, self-consciously so, has been more major, if you will, more like expansionist oriented, cosmological or cosmogonic or what have you. And so when you introduced this book, Geoffrey, it seemed like such a perfect note to play in this symphonic type of piece. And so I appreciate this happening. It feels a little bit like a lucid dream, and I don't want to mess it up because I've dreamed of these kinds of conversations spawning independently of my own volition, and here it is happening, and here I am experiencing it. So I'm just going to let it happen and listen and be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Okay, so I think we're ready for you, Erin, if you want to have a go with maybe just introduce yourself in like everybody else did, and then you can talk a little bit about what brought you into this project.
Well, I'm really honored to be here. It's very moving. Thank you for doing this. I'm also very sick, so I'm a little bit in that lucid dream space that you were talking about, and I feel sort of emotional, but I'm going to blame that on the flu. So I'm sitting here in this kind of transitory state, suffering for having traveled too much this term. My work is always between, and more directed by how other people understand the betweenness of my work. I think it's a kind of weird thing that happens in the academic and art world, so that your life becomes directed by other people's invitations. And so this particular year, I'm being invited to do a lot of dance. I can never really predict how people are going to understand the passage between my different worlds. So I've had this beautiful opportunity this year to be doing several intensive dance projects, which I haven't been doing in the last years so much. And it's put me back in the classroom with young dancers, which has also been really fun. Thinking about where I am, who is what is a dancer who's nearing 50. I noticed that that's that the age is having an effect on how I think about what a body can do, maybe simply because of that number, which seems so strange to me, exciting and strange at the same time. It's also a transitory time because, as Geoffrey knows, we're working very hard on an alternative to the university, which we call the Three Ecologies Institute. My partner has left the university, and as of 2 days ago, it seems we might have a building to operate. So we're building something we call the Three Ecologies Institute, and it's a parasite to the university. It's not at all trying to match the university. We understand the university to be a space that does some things quite well. Builds infrastructures, sometimes better infrastructures than others, but nonetheless, they're infrastructures. It has a power of attraction in terms of its capacity to attract interesting people, so that's interesting. But more and more, it, I think, displays its incapacity to carry its promise, both in relation to the debt economy that it produces and to the exclusions that it manifests, which are very, very apparent in Montreal, where 50% of boys, 30% of those non-white don't finish high school. So there is a question of for whom the university is that we're thinking about a lot. And this is, I'm mentioning this because it's very linked to my work on neurodiversity. I'm very suspicious of the way that the university builds knowledge. And I want to honor the slow knowledge of philosophy, but not within the kind of matrices of hierarchizing language-based knowledge over all other kinds of knowledge. So that's been very intense work. And with that, we've been working extremely hard in a field that is completely outside my areas of knowledge, although I'm finding myself there, which is we're building an economy. So in the work, I mention this again because for me, the philosophical work is only as strong as the worlds it can inhabit and build. And it's become really clear to us that the current financial sectors are not imaginative in the way that they can embrace what else, what other forms of conviviality and sociality can be invented. And so we've been working very, very hard in the world of crypto economies, which are themselves extremely libertarian and not necessarily suited to the kind of work we're trying to do, to try to build a non-transactional, non-service-based, non-individual economy. So this is crazy, I know, but we're working hard and we're trying to build within those environments the potential for minor gestures. And what I'm finding, which is very, very exciting, is that there's an incredible generosity in the world and an incredible openness to these kinds of ventures. Economists have come recently, crypto economists have appeared, and they offer their time and their services and their imaginations. And so it's a reminder that the creative people are not always where you think they are. They're also in business departments and in economy departments and strange hackers on the web and so on. And so always a reminder to me as well that we can find collaborators in places we might not imagine we can find them. The minor gesture, Geoffrey, I was very moved when you read that passage. I'm realizing just these days that I've written another book, and I really do write books backwards. I don't set out to write a book. I usually set out to engage with something that's very dear to me in the world, and the writing happens alongside. And then usually Brian, my partner, tells me I've got a book, and I deny it for about a year, and then I realize that something has grown, and then I go back to it and begin to try to understand what it is that has been growing. And and I mention this because just before I wrote the preface to the minor gesture, I had received Fred Moten's manuscript review of the minor gesture, which was an incredibly moving text. And Fred said to me in that text that all Black life was neurodiverse life for him. And so that's what I've been thinking with in the last couple of years since I wrote the minor gesture, and that's the kind of push of the next work, which I'll be sort of pulling together this summer, which has made me understand something about how worlds, how should I put this? It's made it even clearer to me that there is no such thing as neurotypicality. There are practices that are neurotypical that are incredibly well enforced, that dominate our educational systems and maybe more our educational systems than most other systems, because I don't think capital is particularly neurotypical. It has all kinds of diverse tendencies, however awful we might find them. But as for those of us who are born and bred in an educational system and who continue to allow it to justify our existences, even if it's just in taking salaries from those places, like I do, I think it's probably worth thinking about the ways in which our passing as neurotypicals have hurt us, or maybe even destroyed us at times, and to think about the ways in which, for me at least, these gestures of passing can be addressed in our classrooms, the ways in which we can become more sensitive to all of the layers of passing that are required of those who cross the threshold. So here I'm thinking not only of neurodiversity, but of neurodiversity with race, and neurodiversity with gender, neurodiversity with disability, and so on. And so anyway, that's maybe the place I would begin. I don't feel like an expert on the minor gesture. I really did write the book to put it into the world so that other people would think with me on the minor gesture if they were interested.
Wow. There are so many of the things that you mentioned that are preoccupations of people, you know, of the other people in the virtual room, as it were. So, I mean, Marco and Doug have been looking into cryptocurrencies, and there's a lot of work going on in the Cosmos Co-op about the cryptocurrencies. And of course, there's all the work on disability. Some of us are interested in transgender issues, and of course that ties into the neurodiversity also in interesting ways, as well as disability. So
right. Wow. Well, I didn't know that. Well, for those of you who are interested in cryptocurrencies, we have a new, very exciting collaboration with Holochain, who has now become a partner with SenseLab, and they're the ones who are helping us code. So it's an exciting moment.
That's the one we picked out as being more interesting than Bitcoin.
Well, it's just to give you a sense of the magic. One of our more neurodiverse people at SenseLab, Leslie Plum, who's also our coder, we have a team of only women coders at SenseLab, when we've really grown that team, and they're all neurodiverse, and none of them come to language easily. And so it's been always an interesting challenge to articulate to the more tendentially neurotypical people what's going on. There's a lot of resistance to finance and cryptocurrencies in the world, and definitely at SenseLab too. In any case, one of the, so Leslie, the more neurodiverse coder, she was at the presentation of Holochain, which just happened in Montreal, I think last week, 2 weeks ago. And Leslie, in her beautiful, non-starting at the beginning, neurotypical way of speaking, burst. She really burst. And the head coder of Holochain, Eric is his name, when people tried to, I wasn't there, but when people tried to interrupt, because neurodiverse speaking is it's particular. It's not, it doesn't follow in a linear way. He told the room to be quiet. And he said to Leslie, I have all the time to listen to you. And she spoke, and I thought, wow, I have waited my whole life to hear to hear of a story in a public setting where somebody says, stop, we have time to listen to you. So I was just so moved by it. And I realized that one of the gifts of computing is that it is a neurodiverse environment, and there is practice in that environment to recognize neurodiversity. And what Eric had done was simply recognize that he had a brilliant coder in the room and he wanted to hear what she had to say. And so he wrote us and said, I'm in, what can I do? You know, how can I participate? And I thought, wow, you know, the worlds, they build themselves. You build them like one little chunk at a time. Not by hype, which is what we've been seeing a lot in the cryptocurrency world, but by affinity. And these affinities they're not identity-based. That's what's really interesting to me. They're stronger and more, they're more minor than that, I guess I would say. They're not sort of organized by sending out stakes that are stakes based on identity. I'm important because I have prestige because. So anyway, a little note on holotape.
We might follow up with you on that for Cosmos. I have a whole series of questions, but I don't want to do that. What I'd like to do is I'd like for the other members of the group to bring your questions. So Erin's here just for today, and so I kind of want to take advantage of your presence here, Erin, to bounce ideas back off you. But given that you're sick, maybe we could also just think about making our own comments about the text and not just questions for Erin, so that we can give her a break as well. So I'd like to open the floor to questions or comments about the text.
Well, it's just full of wonderful one-liners. I've been jotting them down. A lot of them pop out. One is, there is no question, it seems to me, that we put too much credence in that which persists in the edifices rebuilt daily by technocrats. There must be other ways of living. And I'm extremely sensitive to that, as there's so much talk about transhumanism and posthumanism and human futures, you know, that are going to be surpassed by our technology. And I'm very phobic when I hear those kinds of discussions going on, because they always seem to read.
John? I think we've lost you, John.
I guess while he possibly reappears, I do have the quote. I highlighted it too, but so I'll read it off again just so we can possibly reflect on it while John comes back. But the minor gesture's indeterminacy and even its failure to thrive is what interests me here. For there is no question, it seems to me, that we put too much credence in that which persists in the edifice rebuilt daily by technocrats. There must be other ways of living. I personally don't have anything to say at this moment. Just wanted to.
Do you want to speak to that, Erin, before John comes back, or?
I mean, it's. I guess I can say something about what brought on the book. The book actually grew out of the chapter that was called The Minor Gestures, so the weather patterns chapter. And it came out of doing an artistic work at the Biennale of Moscow, where I had a sense that the work didn't work. But I was being told by curators that this was the best work I had ever done. So I was confused about the ways in which the institutions in which I work, which are primarily, I would say, the academic institution, the art market more broadly, recognize what I consider to be often exactly that which is less interesting. So what is it that they're recognizing? What is it that the technocrats are busy with? And I think many of us, I'm assuming many of us do this work because we need to. So it keeps us alive. And after I did that exhibition, I fell into a depression, which I do suffer from, so it's not the first one, but I really thought, what's the value of doing art if where it gets recognized is exactly where it stopped doing its work? So what is it about art that works for me or works in the world? And I started to think about ritual, and it's in that chapter, and about how there's a gesture in the contemporary art world of bringing things into a space and then discarding them. It's very common in the visual art world, where you bring in multiples, sort of post Duchamp. And what are they? And there's a kind of idea that these works, these things, and I myself work in multiples, so that, appeals to me, that these things are supposed to have a power in the world, and yet we give them no power outside of the art world, which is to say we don't take them back into our lives. We don't live with them. We don't ask them how they keep us alive. We store them, or in many cases we destroy them. And so I started to think about those relays. What are those relays? The relays between the spaces where we do our work and where we return to. And I started to realize that these relays were what excited me. The sitting down with thinking and the writing, or the working on the work in the studio, or the sitting with a student and talking about a work, or the imagining of a project. But those are precisely the places where there is a kind of reticence in the worlds in which I live to value. And so I guess my sense of there must be other ways of living is also a question to us. I mean, it's not like there's somebody sitting on our heads telling us we have to live this way. So part of the problem is that we also, I then also accept those constraints. I went to the Moscow Biennale even though I knew the work was probably not working, because I wanted to be seen. I wanted the work to be seen. And I also derive a lot of my sense of worth from recognition from the outside. And so I don't ever want to be one or the other. I'm always thinking of the both and. How do those two work together? But it seems to me that that's really important. And the other factor is very specific to Montreal. And by the way, I do want to say that I'm feeling with you, those folks in Toronto, for what happened yesterday. That in Montreal, we had a student strike in 2012 that really, really changed the landscape of the institution. Its effects are less felt today than they were in the first 2 or 3 years afterwards, because a lot of the students have graduated, but they really made it clear that there was an imagination in the world for other ways of living, and the students were imagining it. And for those of you who aren't in Montreal, the student strike lasted 9 months, and there were strikes every single day for that period. There were demonstrations every single day, and most of them were performative. And so I've thought a lot also about how there's a tendency in the culture in which I live to see younger people as the harbingers of change, that we sort of act like the young people should be the risk takers. And yet they're the ones with the most precarity and the most risk. I mean, those of us who are in positions where we can live, that we have jobs or access, prestige, etc. You know, what's stopping us? So anyway, those were the two thoughts that went into that question of what it might be to think about other ways of living.
The issue about young people and the precarity of young people. Doug has been working on an idea around the elders and the fact that you may not need to be old to be an elder.
Ah, nice.
And so I think that's an interesting cross current against this idea of also the risk takers don't have to be young. So again, it's trying to move away from the typical current expectations of what society thinks about these things. Right? So, are there comments?
Oh, you're back.
Here's John. Do you want to? We did follow up on your question, John. I know John is known throughout the site as the guy who listens through all of the recordings afterwards. And so he will go through the recording and listen to the answer. But I do want to give you the opportunity to follow up on your earlier question.
Well, I'm looking forward to listening to this video. So I'll be filled in on what the gap between my last comments and what has been generated here. But I think the gist of it is that I'm looking for, you know, new ways of languaging our potentials that I feel is we're getting a lot of misfiring, like my technology here, my internet connection just dropping out of, and then I don't know what's going on. But I think there's, you know, our attention spans, I think, are being really disrupted. But we live in such a monophasic culture that only recognizes one kind of knowing. And I'm hoping we move towards, and probably are moving towards, a more, I think, polyphasic culture where different phases of consciousness are acknowledged as conveying useful information and perhaps knowledge. So that's my curiosity and openness, and probably why I pay so much attention to the technology and how we can reproduce conversations that may have happened a few days ago or weeks ago or months ago when we can review them. So I think that the fast mind and the slow mind can start to pay attention to one another. Because I feel like that self-reflexive capacity is extremely important, those taking a meta perspective and a distance and a detachment. But also that affective, messy, confused states of consciousness that we often are in most of the time, for me. Those, I think, need to be honored and recognized as very valuable. So that's my 2 cents.
If I could say something to that, it's very important to me what you're saying. And one of the explorations that I've done around this was in a classroom last fall, where I realized that so neurodiversity, maybe this is obvious to you, but I'll just say it in case it's not, is obviously nothing new. But what has shifted is has come with the internet, because autistics, for the most part, classical autistics, so the ones that I'm closest to who don't have access to vocal speech, write, and many of them write, and but they don't write in the at necessarily the speed or the in the moments where we might expect speech to move back, which is to say that the relay of what we're doing right now, speak, 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 is not particularly neurodiverse in that context. And so the internet allowed autistics through blogs to get their voices in. But as I've continued to, and this shift that has happened in the last now almost 20 years has now crossed a threshold. So we've published 2 books, Tita Mukhopadhyay's Plankton Dreams at OHP and Melanie Yargot's Authoring Autism. Melanie Yargot is the first tenured professor who's autistic. You know, what I'm trying to do with neurodiversity is no longer as necessary. Now those voices are speaking for themselves. But there was a kind of in-between time when that wasn't happening as much. And I realize in retrospect that I kind of lived in that relay, although it wasn't particularly clear to me at the time. But in any case, what I've come to realize is that, yes, those are extreme cases on the spectrum. But in a given classroom, once you begin to pay attention, you really have an incredible spectrum. And so the relay in the classroom is incredibly violent for a lot of bodies. And because I teach in studio art, I think, sequesters neurodiverse bodies in a particular way. It's really clear to me that you can end up as a student in fine arts or studio art with what would be considered learning disabilities that are never addressed. So I meet people in a master's who can't read, for example, who have severe dyslexia, but nobody's caught it because they've managed to pass and figure it out and get through and so on. But even more so, I've met a lot of people who have dominant forms of sensory tendencies. I don't know how you would call them, but they're, you know, so they do much better listening to things than reading things, or they can't handle the overhead lights, or the fan in the room is absolutely distracted. Or when Geoffrey was there, some of them need things to pull on, which I have right here, while they talk. And so some of us need to doodle and so on. And so what I did last term was I taught a class on neurodiversity and Black life where the spoken voice was really backgrounded. And I did that through in kind of 2 ways. One of them was I asked the students to self-select for a third of them to be listeners each class. Now, since they were self-selecting, we never knew if it was 2/3 or 1/3 or less than 1/3, but I told them that meant that they had to be listeners at least 1/3 of the time. And to be a listener in a 4-hour class was literally to not speak. And so that meant that I was in a classroom where there could be a lot of silence. And I was also a listener 1/3 of the time, which meant that 1/3 of the time I couldn't speak. But then we had a Google Doc that we could write on. And we had iPods set up in the room that you could turn on to listen to a text or to listen to a piece of music. And the class was a revelation to me. People didn't want to leave at the end. They decided, it was an undergraduate class, the students continued. The class ended in December and they haven't stopped. They still meet every week for 4 hours. And so I realized that there's still a lot for me to learn also about all of those levels. And what I realized is if you allow those levels into the classroom, the students actually don't stop the classroom after that 1 4-hour bit. They continue. So the blog that we had in the Google Doc continued to be written on the whole week, because people felt, I think, that they could engage. The other thing we did was we really built an environment, an architecture. And we built some hiding places, like literally like tunnels. And people would arrive up to an hour early to be in the hiding places. So then we realized a lot of people really don't like being seen. But we never discussed these things because I didn't I didn't think it was a good idea to become self-conscious about them. I thought it would be more interesting to just kind of keep building. And so then what started happening is that the students would come early to build more hiding places. And on the last day of class, we had a Black activist from Montreal, transformative justice, Rachel Zellers. And she walked into the room and she started sobbing. And I think because she'd been an outsider to the process, she could then talk about this. And she said to the students, I need you to tell me what's going on here. I don't understand. You know, how is this possible? How does a university do this? And the students then started to speak about what it feels like to be a body in a classroom where it is required of you that you perform yourself in a particular way. And it was very moving. And I realized that, again, I mean, I realized this over and over again, that you can do very, very rigorous work, because we're reading philosophy. This wasn't an easy class. You can do very, very rigorous work in other ways that allow different bodies to be able to emerge, which is not to say that it works for everybody. I should say that there was a student in the class who was extremely unhappy. And I told him he didn't have to come. We figured out another way for him to participate. I think he was very neurodiverse and he felt too visible, ironically. It was like a class, he was both Black and neurodiverse, and it was just like, ugh, I can't handle this. So he joined us on Skype instead of being there. So, I mean, so anyway, I just feel moved by what you're saying, and I think it's true that there are these different levels of participation and thinking. Yeah.
Thank you.
One of the things I noticed earlier on in my career was that that in order to move out of the practices that are common in the university, you had to take ownership over doing things differently and claim that ownership in order to legitimize it, because the system works by people claiming ownership. So there's something about this, you know, so I'm thinking back over the class that I did with you, Erin, on Whitehead, where you had a little bit like the one that you're talking about now, the one that you did following, but there were all these other practices that were parallel to and interleaving with the classroom discussions. So I think, what am I saying? I'm saying that's in a sense what the minor gesture is all about.
I guess I want to say that for me, that's where the politics are. I think the minor is actually quite dangerous. I mean, in the sense that it can really destabilize, and because we're very familiar with grand gestures. Grand gestures are quite intuitive to us, but the minor, it can unground. And that ungrounding has effects, you know. The student that I mentioned who was very unhappy in the class, I made a real mistake with him. He hadn't been showing up, and I had, these classes are difficult for evaluation, and so I always set up a way to do that. And in this class, everybody had to prepare a minute of sound that we were going to remix together, and so I told him he had to be there, and he came with 2 hoodies. I didn't even know you could wear 2 of them. I mean, if a student, I can imagine a body dressing itself to be invisible more visibly. And I thought, wow, you know, we have to be really careful, because a minor gesture can also be really, I mean, there's no homogeneous way of doing this work. You always have to attend to the details, and the details are unmooring. And in that case, I mean, I was really distraught, and felt I'd been very insensitive, and realized, you know, how much work it is to do this, particularly because, as Geoffrey knows, the university space has not been an easy one for me to navigate. I'm a full professor now, so it's probably a little bit harder to get rid of me, but it hasn't been a joyful rise. There isn't that much support for this kind of work.
Erin, may I ask, in your new work, this parasitic organization, or maybe it's not even an organization, do you feel more space to move in?
Well, you see, the Three Ecologies Institute comes out of the SenseLab, which I started growing in 2004. And so the Three Ecologies doesn't exist yet quite, although some people would say it's existing. I mean, I don't know what constitutes existence. So it's a hard question for me to answer. I mean, maybe we live in these, like, sort of depends the time of day that you ask me. You know, I think I'm generally very, very discouraged by the university, at the same time as I feel that the university gives me an enormous gift in being able to teach. I tried to quit last spring. I spoke to the dean. I felt I couldn't support the students the way I felt was my role. And we have a very beautiful dean right now. She's amazing, Rebecca Duclos. And she said to me, Erin, I just please let us invent a way that this can be possible. So I don't want to seem at all like it's an all or nothing proposition, but it is something I really struggle with. And I think what I struggle with that could link us back to the reading on the minor gesture is that I don't think, for me, that there is a kind of linear way in which we come to knowledge. So if I'm sitting in a department meeting and people are so certain that you need to know this before you need to know this, for example, or that, you know, people tell me all the time, profs tell me all the time that my courses are too hard. And I always think, what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean that something's too hard? Like, why do we think undergraduates are not as smart? Where does that come from? I mean, 5-year-olds are brilliant. Like, how do we know these things? And so I'm surrounded often by people who are actually quite lovely in other ways, but who are so certain that as professors we know, and I'm not so certain. And so I often just feel confused and scared and uneasy. I mean, it's not, but then I go back to the classroom and I think, wow, you know, what we're doing together, it's really special. So I'm torn all the time. The situation I'm in is also maybe different than some of you, because I do mostly research creation work, which means that I'm often with mid-career artists. So I'm working with people who are my age or older all the time, as well as really young people. So I've got people in my PhD classes who are young autistics, like 12. You know, so I could have a range in a room of like 12-year-olds to 7-year-olds. And they're having these amazing conversations. And I'm seeing this happen. And I want the whole university to see, look, this is amazing. It's happening. But then I'm told, well, Erin, you know, you can't just let anybody into your classes or whatever. And it's just hard, you know. So that's more what I struggle with. But I don't have my head in the sand. I don't think that there's like a perfect place out there where things are easier. I just think that this particular machine, because I'm in it, I'm aware of its deficiencies and its fissures. And I really would dream of having this kind of parasitical space where many of us would contribute and collaborate to imagine other ways of learning that are not threatened by our fears of losing our positions. I mean, I don't have that threat. I'm safe. But, you know, pre-tenure profs are threatened, or PhD students are threatened. And I'm aware of that. And I'm aware of the incredible, I see it in my own students. I see that my neurodiverse students who really couldn't give a fuck about the university's prestige economy, they really threaten the professors. They really, and I'm so proud of them, but it's not easy. You know, the other profs say to them, well, you should have had this. And the students are like, why? You know, and I I'm with them. Like, yeah, okay, let's have that conversation. Why do you think this methodology is more important, or whatever, you know? So it's difficult, and it's like you know, there's a door that's been opened, and people come right into it, and they push, and so anyway, it's an uneasy, uneven answer, but I hope it. Yeah.
Erin, can I take you back to when you first came to the university?
Mm-hmm.
And in what you're talking about now, and in looking as to what has evolved and how your thinking has evolved and how your writing has evolved, what did that feel like when you came to the university, and how did you negotiate those living in a world of grand gesture and also bringing yourself in as a dancer? And I found it very interesting when you were introducing yourself as well too, that you're coming back to that space now as a dancer, and it's a place that you haven't been for a while. I'm asking probably 2 or 3 questions here, but what did that feel like when you came to the university, and how, as a dancer, is that how did that influence you at the time, and how is it influencing you now?
Yeah, so I came to the university a little bit sideways. I had been, I left home at 14, and I'd been financially independent for a while. I did my studies in Germany, where it was free. I worked as a professional dancer. I had an art gallery that I ran, which sounds bigger than it was. It's the size of my futon, where I also slept, you know. And I did a PhD mostly because I was waitressing, and I mean, it was a question like a lot of artists have, you know, I don't really want to waitress anymore. Is there a possibility of another kind of employment? And so my PhD, which was my first book, Ephemeral Territories, was really helping me ask questions I had as an artist. And when I was, before I defended my PhD, I had the luck of Minnesota Press asking to publish the book. So I was in a strange position where I defended my dissertation with a book in press. And I didn't think I was going to continue in academia. I sort of felt like I had done what I wanted to do, which was work out a problem that I had around the question of home, which was what the book was about. And then I was quite precarious, and I also make clothing, and I'd had a boutique, and I realized that being a clothing designer was incredibly exhausting because you had to make the clothes over and over and over again. And it wasn't going to work for me because I actually only was interested in making them once. So I decided to apply for some jobs. And in the first round, I was, again, extremely fortunate. I was offered a position at Harvard, and I was offered a position at London School of Economics. But it was clear to me that I couldn't accept those positions, that it would be incredibly miserable in both of those places. Because what moves me to do the work is not institutional. I don't know how else to put it. I need an environment where I can learn, and more privileged environments don't work that well for me. And so then I applied for some positions in Montreal, and the position that I had my heart set on was actually at the Université de Montréal, which was where I met Brian Masumi. I didn't get it, but I did get Brian, so it was all good. And then I applied for a job at Concordia, but I thought it was a part-time job. But it was a Canada Research Chair. But I don't come from an academic background, and I just didn't know. I hadn't done my research well enough. So I'm telling you all of this because the irony was that the position which I should have been most nervous about, I was least nervous about, because I thought I was just applying for like a part-time contract. And so when I received the position, I was in shock, because then I realized what I had, you know, and I got very afraid, And so that's why I started SenseLab, because I wanted to see if I could find a way that I wouldn't be completely subsumed by the institution. So I just simply sent out a call to people and said, do you think you'd be interested in other ways of collaborating? Are you interested in thinking across activism, philosophy, and art? So the SenseLab grew at the very same time as I started my position. And it wasn't in the university for many years. We were nomadic. And then it began to grow in other places as well. And so I always had that other world that I could connect to. But then, because I was in the university and other than university, I hadn't been to school, I was homeschooled. So I realized quite early that there were some norms of institutional life that I didn't understand. In retrospect, if I had understood better, I now know what I should have done to make my life easier. But I didn't understand that, you know, you could be a lot happier in the university if you gave in to hierarchical models, for example. I just didn't know that that's what you needed to do. So it wasn't easy at all. I was, when I went up for contract renewal, they tried to take away my position on the basis that they said I was distracting students. Which by that, you know, was written out that I held reading groups, that I mixed students of different ages together, that students were slowed down in their thesis writing because of the work that I did. And but I already had 2 books, so you know, I went to the lawyer at Concordia and I said, you know, can they get rid of me? And they said, no, you just have to have 1 journal article. Like, contract renewal is actually not about whether they like you or not. Then when I went up for tenure, I'm in both cinema and studio art. In studio art, they said that my practice didn't qualify as artistic practice because it didn't happen in galleries enough. So that was a surprise. And I just didn't really know how to articulate my surprise to that. You know, I thought, wow, you know, like, we've had 50 years of that. I thought that would be recognized. And then in film studies, they told me that Relationscapes was not a book that they wanted to consider because it seemed like I was too influenced by students. And what they meant by that is that I hadn't come into the university writing on dance and movement, and I had articulated to them that my writing on dance and movement came out of students that I was supervising and recognizing that there was so little work on movement. And they didn't think that that was scholarly. They thought that what was scholarly was continuing what you were already doing. So once again, I had to get lawyers. And so it was very confusing. After that, I went to the dean and I said, I don't think I belong here. It's too much work. You know, I need to get back to my artwork, and I feel exhausted and sad. And the dean said to me, well, you know, what do you want? You know, are you applying for other jobs? And I said to her, why would I apply for another job? Like, isn't it this bad everywhere? And so she said to me, well, you know, why don't you stay? And so it's been this kind of push and pull. I have a feeling, but it's just a feeling, that I'm in my 15th year, that people are kinder as I'm there longer. I've never had a hard conversation with anybody or a disagreement with anybody. So maybe over time they're realizing that one person doing things a little bit differently isn't going to topple the whole structure. So I'm sorry to say that I don't have very, you know, I mean, none of these words are going to make you feel like you can survive this, except that there are more of us. And now I know who they are. Because over the years, I've connected to people who are also at Concordia and other departments who have also struggled and who might feel like misfits, who don't fit as easily in environments. So yeah, what can I say? It's an odd place. And perhaps the hardest thing for me is that I don't really want the students to know any of this. And so I don't talk about it. I don't think it's their, I don't want them to have to worry about professors who are uneasy with each other. So I always support my colleagues. And, but the students aren't stupid. And so sometimes I think, they hear things, and it's sad to me that they have to feel these tensions.
Although it is interesting, I always, I don't know if enjoy is the word, but I appreciate when you talk about these things, because, I mean, Cora has issues with her university. She's not exactly an ordinary prof in an ordinary place. Jocelyn neither is also in difficulties with the university. And although I have a career, Pat had an unusual career as well. And Pat, and although I have a kind of a classical career, I'm not like that underneath. I relate to what Doug said at the beginning. I'm not neurotypical the way I appear to be on the surface. So
you don't actually even appear to be neurotypical.
Just as well.
I would agree.
So it is interesting to hear these, that there are many of us who struggle with the universities and the way they're built, and perhaps not just universities, but institutions in general, because they're all a bit similar, whether they're.
I should just add to this. I know that I think John wanted to say something, but I can't I can't underemphasize how much Geoffrey coming to my class changed things, because students need to see us working together. They were so moved by that, and they still talk about it, that another professor would take the time to participate. And I think it gave the student a sense that there's a kind of collegiality that is possible. And I know from talking to other colleagues at the university, because I do have colleagues who are lovely, obviously, that one of the things we're most sad about is that we don't have time to support each other in our classrooms, that we would really love to sit in each other's classrooms and sort of show students that we're allies and that we're not scared of not knowing the same things. And so when Geoffrey was there, it was so beautiful, because you were a novice at Whitehead and not a novice at all kinds of other things. And I know that you gave the students the courage to be novices as well. So I know there are ways we can do this, and those are beautiful. It's just that they're not always the ways in which we work, unfortunately, partly because the neoliberal university makes us all overworked.
Thank you. I know Jocelyn wanted to, I'll come back to you, John. I'll let Jocelyn go first, okay?
Sure.
Yes, first of all, thank you. Can you hear me? I'm not sure about my microphone. Yes, first of all, thank you so much. I feel so weird at my place at university. I feel I don't belong there as well. But I felt that someone so brilliant as you should not be placed in this situation. And I never imagined that could happen to you. You talk about lawyer and and I always keep that for myself, because I feel like I'm not normal, and it's normal that happens to me because I'm not normal. And also myself, like, I didn't share that with my students because I feel they are very fragile. They need to be supported, so it's not my place. So I really. I'm very thankful that you share that with us. I know it's difficult to share this kind of story with people you barely know, and I really feel something special that you share that with us. And also I would like to come back to one thing you say that I really relate to, is that I'm not sure that university builds the knowledge that they should, and the way they should transmit it. I'm very worried about the content of what we transmit to the student. I'm not talking about technology there. I'm not talking about knowledge that we already know, but I'm talking about the knowledge we should build, and the knowledge we should build has to go with, interaction with people, and not interacting that you sit down, I'm talking. Well, I love that talking, but it's not. We are not supposed to do that only. We are supposed to bring people all together to build knowledge and to transmit this knowledge. And for that, we need to be very open. Yesterday, I participated to a seminar about systematization in medicine, and how medicine should restrict themselves to do one particular thing. And I showed them that by doing this research this way, they were cutting themselves from all part of the knowledge that opened the door to a new methodology that should be there. And for the first half of my life, they agree on what I said, which really bring me down, because I say, wow, the first time someone listened. But it was amazing. And I'm really, how could I say that? When you talk about bringing a new parallel university, I'm really amazed, because of course I'm by myself all the time, but it's really something that's filling a need. I mean, it's something that we should look towards, because there is no way we can build knowledge in the way we build today. It's bringing people back to the bad feelings they have, the inability to learn, the inability to communicate. And it's not like this we are built. We are not like piece of stone, and we are something else. So it's damaging, especially to people who think they are students and they are teachers. And it's like, like you have two different words and they cannot never reach it. And it's not like that. It's not built to be like that. So I would like to thank you for saying all of this, because it's, for me, it's new. And I mean, not new because I know Geoffrey, but it's a new that someone I don't know so well. I mean, open this door. I'm really impressed, really. And also I would like to thank you, Cora, to share the story with us, because it's like, I do appreciate, I feel related, really. Thank you.
Charlie?
Oh, yes, thank you. I think, Erin, you said something about being a parasite of the university. And you also spoke about being sort of a go-between between neuroatypical and neurotypical audiences or communities, and that you sort of can drop that because so many neuroatypical persons are now able to articulate their own difference in their own way. And I found that very compelling because I feel like I resonate with that as a gay man. I dropped out of college after taking all the acting classes and directing classes, and I went to New York and started my own theater company. And I learned a lot from that. And then all of a sudden the AIDS epidemic hit, and many of my friends were very sick of this mysterious disease. No one knew how to categorize. And I started to, and I was offered a job. I was working in a corporate setting and I was making money. And then someone asked me, I was volunteering a lot, working with people with AIDS. And someone said, would you join this organization, People with AIDS Coalition? And I turned it down because I didn't want to be answering the phone, person with AIDS, person with AIDS, person with AIDS every day. Because I felt, as you mentioned in your text, I think you're quoting Deleuze, you don't want to get sucked into that black hole of identifying with a marginalized population. And I realized there's other ways of me to serve without identifying as that with another label, especially if that label was one that didn't fit anybody particularly well. But I know that labels, sometimes we use labels to label something and dismiss it, or we use a label to promote a certain cause. So I'm not saying those major gestures that create labels are irrelevant. But I think that idea of being a parasite, and what you talk about, the capitalist system has a rhythm that we adapt to, but that, certainly we have to learn as parasites, creative parasites, to live in a way that we the system lives off of us, and we have to find a way of living off of that system. So I found myself being in the in-between many times and being a spokesperson on behalf of others. As late in my career, I started working with people with Alzheimer's. And I was a companion to a lady who died recently in her 90s, late 90s. And I worked with her for a long time. So I saw the progression of the illness. And but she was very good at certain things. She could dance. And I took her dancing to Fred Astaire studio twice a week. You know, the foxtrot, the tango. She could do all of that. So she had her autobiography was vanishing rapidly, but her episodic memory was still intact. So I just did whatever she could do. And she could read out loud, but she could not speak a sentence with any kind of syntax. It was all scrambled. And but I had the best time with her. I mean, every day to me was an adventure, going into the unknown. And when she passed away, I'll just say this, I was with her when she died, and I was the only person with her. Even though I was a paid companion, her family was not there, and she didn't remember any of her family members anyway. But she came up out of this, like, it was beatific, radiant, totally connected, and she just made these clear, crystal clear, publishable sentences, expressing her gratitude for our friendship and how much she had learned from it. And wow. I was like, wow, that just took me to another place entirely. And I'm just wondering about, we don't know what these geriatric wards with people drooling in their oatmeal. I mean, those low expectations we have of people, I just feel is more awful than the actual disease process. Like labeling someone a person with AIDS, or designating a person, if they have HIV, this is the future this person's going to have. I just always rebelled against that. So thank you for giving me the courage to sort of review my sometimes troubled life and look at the alternative histories that maybe I haven't paid enough attention to, as I believe you are doing as well. So thank you.
Oh, it's so beautiful what you're saying, and it's so much at the heart of the ethos of what I'm trying to touch on. When I started working with the autistics, they told me that neurotypicals had very limited appreciation of the complexity of dementia. And they said we were just sort of bordered off. We couldn't see it, we couldn't feel it, that these people are really thinking beings, that they're incredibly alive.
Right.
And I really believe that. I lived it not in quite the same way as you did, but my stepfather, who was more than a father to me, had Parkinson's, and Parkinson's is on the continuum with autism, which is to say it's not the same disease, but it has executive function issues and motor disturbances that are similar. So I was quite familiar with certain aspects of what he was going through. What was interesting was, I don't know if you've gotten to that part of the book yet, or if you know my earlier work, you'd know about this, but I talk a lot about how autistics say that neurotypicals chunk. And what they mean by that is that neurotypicals put things into categories, literally, physiologically. That when we enter a room, we see chairs and desks and stoves and fridges and people and so on. And but neurodiversity is, different forms of neurodiversity, but let's just say autism, it can take up to 5 minutes for the world to chunk. And physiologically speaking, all of us take time to chunk. I mean, it's not immediate for any of us. It's just about the rate of a half second for those who have executive function that works normally, whatever normal means. And but those of us who are in positions of extreme stress can take longer to chunk, or trauma, or LSD, or there are different situations. And so what I realized was two things. One of them is that all of my arts training is training to unchunk. I mean, that's what we teach people. I mean, not necessarily when we're teaching ballet, but in most artistic environments, we teach unchunking. And And when we perceive something like a dementia, we perceive it as lacking because we perceive it as a chunk. What you're saying is, there are these tendencies, these livelinesses. There's a Danish group that works with Alzheimer's in a really interesting way. You might have read about them. They have a village that they've put aside in Denmark for people with severe dementia. And the village has no borders, which is to say everybody lives in the village and it's no problem if you get lost because somebody will find you. And so the village is populated by people who have memory issues. And every year they go on a trip. And they say, it's not about whether these people remember the trip. They live it. Like, since when does memory trump living? So anyway, those are the things that are very important to me. And as I see this phase shifting in my life from autism, maybe specifically to neurotypicality more broadly, in relation to questions of race particularly, and taking seriously Fred Moten's idea of that Black life has always been neurodiverse life. So wondering who has the claim to neurotypicality. If Fred is right that people of color have never had that claim, then neurotypicality stands in for a kind of whiteness that is systemic. What does that mean? What does it mean in terms of mental health? What does it mean in terms of aging? And that also is to say, comes back to the question of sexuality. Who doesn't have the claim to neurotypicality? Do gays or queers or trans have the claim to neurotypicality? I don't think so. Not unless they pass. I mean, we can all play, not all of us, some of us, most of us are here in this particular setting can play the game of passing well enough that we can, that we've trained ourselves to be decipherable in the way that we can claim neurotypicality to some degree. Some people have, no claim to that. And that's been on my mind as well with the shooter in Toronto. Many of us were very scared when they came out and said that he was autistic. My mother called me right away to tell me, that, Erin, you should know, what autistics can do. I want to kill the world when they do this. Like somehow whiteness can be generalized, but, like you never expect that because it's a white guy, every white person is like this. But as soon as you have a mental illness, everybody with a mental illness is a killer, or everybody who's Black is a killer, or whatever. And I kept thinking, as I'm sure a lot of people of color did, wondering if he'd been Black, if he would have been alive. We've heard a lot about the police officer doing this incredible work of not killing him. It's sad in the world when that's what's on the news. But anyway, and wondering, what was registering in that moment that allowed him to stay alive, which doesn't register in so many instances.
Thank you.
So I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I do want to give everybody a chance to speak. So there are a few people. Okay, Hannah, go ahead.
Sorry, this question's going to sound very technical. But I was just looking at, so on page 7, at the last paragraph, it says, the capacity to actualize at the edge of the virtual where the actual is not yet is what makes a minor a gesture. And I was just wondering, because you brought in Black life and neurodiversity, I guess what I'm asking is that these are kind of like minor, I suppose, social formations that already exist, mm-hmm. Whereas the sign kind of indicates that it's not actual. Mm-hmm. So is it? I'm not sure. Is it a either or both? Where is it about kind of breaking through the kind of normative frameworks to see what's already existing, or is it about kind of experimenting to see what else can be created?
That's a great question, and it's I would say it's a question that always needs to be thought over when one engages with process philosophy, and it's the reason I think why there's been some reticence over the years and decades in feminist studies and in post-colonial studies and Black studies toward a process philosophical approach. I mean, in Black studies, it's a bit different right now because Fred Moten is such a process thinker and he's so dominant. So there's a shift happening in Black studies also through his students. But so for me, the way I would begin to answer that question is this, of course, both and. The inheritances that we carry with us, they make us. But those inheritances are not all actualized in every moment. So what I try to think about is what inheritances can we not unmake? So that's sort of where I've started to begin over the last years. So for example, I train young autistic Black men, teenagers, to pretend that they have eye contact. I don't need to train white autistic teenagers. But the problem is if you're a Black autistic teenager and you can't do eye contact, you're in more danger with the police. So that's an example of an inheritance. It's written in the body. It has effects that are direct, unfortunately, in the cultures in which we live. And that came to me because I met some parents who were very anguished at what they perceived as a certain violence they were doing to their children by requiring them to give in to certain social norms in order to be able to stay alive. You know, another example of that is a Black friend of mine who said to me, her son, who's also an early teenager, came home from school yesterday or the day before running. And she said to him, "You don't run. You just don't run. You can't. It's too dangerous." And I think, wow, okay, right. Never had to tell our son not to run, right? So those inheritances are things I never want to overlook. But I also don't want to give full credence to the power structures that organize those bodies in those ways. Because that's also a colonial approach to say, well, you know, this is what the body is. And so what I become interested in are what can't register, what doesn't register. And I'll give a concrete example. You guys might have read about it. It's been in all of Claudia Rankine's talks over the last year. But Claudia Rankine talks, I don't know if you know her, she's a poet. She's got the MacArthur a couple of years ago. She's pretty amazing, a Black poet. And she talks about being at the post office, and there was a tall Black woman and a small white man in front of her. No, the small white man was behind her. And the postal officer said next, and the white man said yes, and he went forward. And the Black woman said to him, "Oh, you must not have seen me." And he said, "Yeah, I didn't see you." And Claudia Rankine talks about this problem of registering. What registers for whom? So my feeling is that minor gestures are don't necessarily register across constituencies. And which is why, for example, as a white person, I can walk in neighborhoods and not register things that other people who are of color, or I don't necessarily register in metros what disabled people register in Montreal or whatever. We're not attending to those fine instances of variation that compose our worlds. And so I that's what I'm trying to think. How do we work across? What is the work? What is the political work of that acrossness? What does it take? And in the final chapter of the minor gesture, I try to think about it in relation to Indigenous life in Canada. And what I'm noticing in my collaborations with Indigenous people is that they take a lot of time because there's a lot to be moved through. Trust takes time. And the temporalities of those encounters are what needs to be attended to if you want to have access to what can't be registered easily across two constituencies. And so it's not that I want to suggest that there's like one size fits all, but I have a feeling that it is here where variations can occur. The other thing that is in that sentence is that I'm trying to articulate there why it's a gesture. And the reason I'm trying to do that is because there is this vocabulary of the minor and the major in Deleuze and Guattari. And while it's incredibly influential to me, they're talking about it in literary terms. They're talking about Kafka and as a minor literature. And because I'm a mover, I think gesture is something that I'm very attuned to. That is not only that which is visible as a gesture, but that which inclines the world, that which inflects existence, that which exceeds the human and modulates. The weather is an obvious one right now because we've waited so long for spring. And so I want to also talk about how the gestures perform in ways that exceed us. They're not ours to perform. These are not our gestures to choreograph, but we can create the conditions to register them, to attune to them, and so on. And so it's a real attempt on my part to again, as I've been doing over the years, to really emphasize that we're not at the center of the world. The human it's just part of the ecology, and if we could just take ourselves a little bit less seriously long enough to recognize what else is going on, maybe we could compose differently.
Thank you.
Does that meet the question?
Yeah.
I was going to say it's a good segue into a question that I had, or a comment, I guess, more than maybe a question and a comment. But so it's this part of the text at the end, near the end, where you're talking about agency. And we've had this discussion before also. But in a way, when at first I was reading that text, it looked like you were sort of moving towards some sort of determinism. But then what I noticed is instead, it's not really about, it's not a rethinking of determinism, it's a rethinking of freedom. You know, and they are linked, but they are different. And I found the discussion about rethinking freedom as this thing that isn't necessarily volition, but has these components that come from the movement rather than are imposed from without, as being, for me, maybe not a new way, because I can see the roots of that approach in your own work before and in some of our discussions, but there's something interesting and new about that for me.
Yeah, thanks for noticing that. It's the place where I thought I would be skewered. So far, to my knowledge, I haven't been. I mean, that doesn't mean people aren't skewering me elsewhere, and they just haven't told me about it. I don't look very closely to find out how people are reacting, but it's perhaps the move that I make in the book that is the most important to me. So I'll just take a step back. Some of you may not, or most of you may not, you haven't read the whole book, but in the world of autism and neurodiversity, there's a hierarchy of volition that happens, which is to say that autistic bodies are mostly considered involuntary bodies, which is to say that they can't control their movements. And the uncontrolled movements, which you also see in Parkinson's and Tourette's and so on, are considered to be meaningless. And you see this also in spastic bodies. And what seems really clear to me is that we're trained from very early age to understand spastic or involuntary moving bodies as unintelligent. And I do it too. I notice it. That that if you can't control the form, you assume there's no way of controlling thought. It's a strange thing, actually. But with all of my contact with autistics, I've also seen how much those movements, so-called involuntary, which I then call non-voluntary, I'm not interested in that dichotomy between involuntary and voluntary, as the book goes on, that they do a lot. So for example, if you're talking to, if I'm having a conversation with Adam, for example, Adam's in Toronto, he's just turned 15. I do weekly Skypes, philosophy Skypes with him. I have a lot of autistics that I work with as a teacher, just informally. and who are excluded from education. Adam will type and then he'll run. And then he'll be back and type. And the running is super important. He's doing something. When we had Adam at the SenseLab a couple of years ago, we noticed that after 2 days, a lot of people started doing that. So whereas the first 2 days people stayed sitting down, by the last 2 days, the so-called neurotypicals were also getting up. And so there's something going on in the way we're trained to understand learning and sitting, or learning and stilling. We're told in our childhood, stand still, focus. Focus means stop moving. And while there are deviations from that, I mean, Cora will recognize that in dance, we move to know what we're doing. We don't discuss a movement, we move into it to understand and remember it. You will usually stop moving to talk. So it's interesting how we, even there, sequester the two. But, you know, dance is particular in that regard because it tends to be a nonverbal environment. A lot of dancers are very insecure about their capacity for language. I notice in supervising them. But so what I'm trying to do, Geoffrey, is to trouble this idea of what I call this triad of agency, volition, intentionality. Doing that, I fully understand the role that agency has had in the last couple of decades or longer in relation to people of color, feminists, disability folks. But I think that the move, if you look in the history of it, is pretty paternalistic. I mean, usually their agency has been given to them by somebody who had the agency to begin with. So the men had the agency and then the women got the agency, or the able-bodied people had the agency and then the disabled people had the agency. And so, and I think in the current moment of thinking about race systemically, there's a lot of argument that can be made about moving away from the personal narrative and the personal agency to ask how the world has agency. So what's happening here beyond this individual body to allow this action to happen? How is the action in the world contributing to an image of voluntariness, or to an image of intentionality, or to an image of will? How do we tell the story of our movement to give it that kind of story of agency? And so that's why I prefer the French word agencement, because agencement, I mean, in French, agency doesn't exist. Now we're calling it agentivité, but that's sort of importing a word from English into French. But agencement has always carried with it the environmental. Agencement is how the environment comes together. It's a dispositif. It's an activation of an ecology of which the body's movements are one, but not alone. So that's where I'm trying to go, to then try to think of freedom not in relation to the individual. And I feel politically that if we do that, we have a better chance at getting outside of a kind of neoliberal individualism that allows us always to use the minority as a case study, as an individual case study. So we say, like, I know 2 people who are autistic who don't suffer in this way, or I know 1, whatever. You know how that goes. So anyway, I hope that answers it.
So it's related to what you were saying earlier also about identity and the fact that I mean, again, identity is something that's been strongly used by the Black movement, the feminist movement, but there is a sense where identity is maybe too large a concept and one needs to look at the bits that go into it.
Yeah, how? I mean, I always think the question is how. You know, in these conditions, how to begin. And in some cases, you have to begin there because that's where you're forced to begin. You know, if we look at the case of the man, Stefan, in his grandmother's backyard who was shot for holding a cell phone, you got to begin with identity because it killed him. But it's not the only thing that activated the complexity that he was. So what else was growing? Well, I mean, hundreds of years of slavery and a history of certain organization of bodies and a certain history of family and a certain idea of what constitutes a worthwhile body or a valuable body, or who fits into the spectrum of the human, and so on. And so I would always want to, I mean, you know this, and maybe all of you know this, but I'm in worlds often where people are very gatekeepy. And so if you're doing this, you can't do that. And I want to say, you know, let's not do that. Like, why does this way of thinking, how does this way of thinking move you forward? And how can we speak across those ways of thinking? I tend to begin with the minors, so it works for me, but that doesn't exclude other kinds of thinking that do it differently. And I try to work from there. And then to think that what we do as thinkers and makers is we build a constellation. And we need those constellations. We build on each other's work, and we amplify each other on our work rather than, you know, being in competition with each other.
Thanks. So we're coming to the top of the hour. Pat, you haven't spoken. Did you want to say something, or?
I'd just like to say thank you.
Thank you.
And Juan, you haven't. Did you have?
Yeah, I also wanted to thank everybody. And I was really moved by what you said about these people going out in a field trip with Alzheimer and stuff like that. My wife is a psychologist, and she worked a lot with people with different kinds of disabilities, especially in neurocognitive kind of stuff. And she told me something that really I hadn't even considered. And it is that people don't value the happiness of people with this non-neurotypical. Let's say if I make a person with Alzheimer's happy, everybody else will be like, why do you do it? They'll forget it. But she told me that actually, even though they might forget the action, the happiness will be inside them. They'll feel happy for even days. Even though they don't know why, they will be happy for a lot of time. So your action is quite meaningful, even though people just disregard it. So thanks for sharing.
You know, there was a moment that was incredibly touching for me around that. We had a series at SenseLab for a while called Knots of Thought. And we invited people to come with a knot, like something they couldn't undo, that they wanted to collectively undo. Can you hear me? Yeah. And so Brian's mother had Alzheimer's, and he came with that knot that was exactly what you were talking about having done this work in process philosophy his whole life and understanding how to speak these things, but then wanting to be known as himself to her. And this incredible uneasiness with sort of understanding philosophically that the world was an environment and she was responding to the environment, but feeling like his memories were going to be lost if they were lost with her. And this was in a public space, and there were a surprising number of people in that space who were going through the same thing. And it was one of the most moving conversations I had, because nobody was trying to solve the problem. Nobody was trying to say you should do it this way or you should do it that way. Everybody was just saying, wow, yeah, we build ourselves through the memories of others. It's true. And so when we have a loved one who doesn't know us the way we want to be known, it's hard. But then we also could take a step back and think, I mean, if I think about my family, I don't think they know me for who I am. Not really. You know, they know what they know about me. But I guess most children have always felt a little bit unseen. And so maybe the world doesn't see us in quite that way. Maybe that's also part of the narrative that we build, that we're knowable because we're memorable, because people remember us. So anyway, I'm just moved by what you were saying. I think when I think of the Three Ecologies Institute, I dream of people coming in and teaching us how to know differently, exactly in that way, that perhaps a person with Alzheimer's would come and teach us to dance. Or I think often about Down syndrome. You know, in Europe, almost all, in Northern Europe, almost all Down syndrome fetuses are aborted. It's 98%. And there's no evidence that Down syndrome folks have a quality of life that isn't good, most of them. I mean, some of them have heart conditions. But there's also evidence that Down syndrome kids learn to read faster than neurotypical kids if they're given visual tools. And so I also dream of, bringing some Down syndrome 4-year-olds together and neurotypical 4-year-olds. Like, I don't think of this alter university as being confined to this idea that we learned from the ages of 18 to 30 or whatever the university speaks to, but rather to think, well, what does it feel like if you go into a room or you go into a Skype or a chat and you learn to learn differently for a few minutes. And I guess that's the risk I want to be able to take more often. I want to be able to not know things more often. And I'm constantly aware of how destabilizing that is in institutions that are constantly requiring that you articulate your progress in areas and your expertise. So yeah, thank you.
And in relation to dementia, there's also the problem with the eye. So this is the construction that we do after the fact of what's going on. Actually, I mean, this idea that we are an eye isn't necessarily the best way to understand what a human is. And patients with dementia who can't articulate an eye doesn't mean to say they're not human, right? So that's also part of and you talk about that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really strong link that I've been making to Black studies, because Sylvia Winter's work is so important. If you get a chance, if you haven't read it, she talks about the history of colonialism and the ways in which it articulates who fits into the category of the human, and really talks about how excluded the colonized subjects are from that category. And of course, with that exclusion, we know, for example, from the Third Reich, who else gets excluded? Very quickly, the disabled folks get excluded, the so-called sexual deviants get excluded. It's fast, the exclusion. And this category called I is so shifting in our lives. So it's odd to me that we're so sure about it, that we're so sure we know how it includes us in the concept of the human. Yeah.
Any last thoughts from anybody? Marco?
How about Jocelyn?
Okay, Jocelyn.
Oops, you're muted.
Micro. Ton microphone.
Hang on.
Sorry about that. Yes, it's page 7, and it's just a small question. Maybe it's not really relevant, but for me it is, because I'm working on the movement as well, and I would like to understand a bit better the words. You say this capacity to actualize at the age of the virtual, where the actual is not yet, is what makes us the minor gesture. And the minor is a gesture insofar as it punctuates in act, leading the event elsewhere than towards the government, sorry for my English, fixity of the major, be it the major in the name of normative political structure. I will not read all of it, but what I would like to ask you is that, first of all, when we talk about the virtual, you talk about virtual as an imagination, like something we have in our brain, like something we're trying to imagine, or you're trying, or you talk about the virtual in a way that is more about how people can feel about virtual. So this is my first question, and the second one is about your definition, because I feel like this one is very structured as a definition, and I feel like you define the gesture as not only a movement, but like a pre-movement that we made with our brain, and this is very interesting for me because I think that I'm not completely catching everything, but I feel like some part of the truth is there, and it's this complexity of, it's not really a gesture as we can see physically, but it's a gesture that I would like to tend, that like an intention somehow. So it's my two questions.
No, they're important. Yeah, so the virtual is coming out of Bergson. So it's neither of those definitions, and it's a good question to ask. The easiest way to translate the virtual into a common vocabulary is with potential. So what Bergson talks about is the way that every act carries a potential with it that doesn't quite actualize. So there's a quality in the world that is always unactualizable. And by actualize, I really mean right now here, actualizing in a kind of pragmatic way. So for example, the back of your computer right now, it's not actual, but you're pretty sure there's a back to your computer. So there's a kind of living with what's not there that is part of your experience. But philosophically speaking, what becomes interesting to me, and for me, the more than and the virtual are very much the same, is the degree to which we give credence to what is actual over what is virtual. So if you come home and your partner is upset and you say to them, is everything okay? And they say, yeah, everything's fine. You might still feel that it's not the case, but you can't really prove that it's not the case. But you feel it, and your feeling of it affects everything else, right? So what I'm trying to get at with the minor gesture is that all movement carries this share that it is actually why choreography is impossible. If you think of choreography as an organizing of bodies, absolutely. You can never organize a body, ever. It always exceeds its actuality. It has processes that exceed how it comes into the world, that are in advance of it and behind it. So it's not in the imagination, it's in the world. And I think that many of us have words for it. Potential. Sometimes we can think of it as intuition. Sometimes we could think of it as imagination. The reason I don't like to think of it as imagination is I don't want to put it in the head. I want to put it in the world. I don't want to separate body and world in that way. I want to think about the world in the way that some of us have known with children, where I always tell this story, but I'm sure I'm not the only one, where when our son was little, he hurt himself, he fell. And when Brian asked him where it hurt, he pointed at the earth. Right? Mm-hmm. So this is, I always think about that. So what is it about our experience in the world that has taught us that the hurt is on this surface and not on that surface? Autistics ask me that all the time, how neurotypicals are so sure the hurt is not in the world. And I say to them, I think they're just confused. So that's in the virtual, that's where it's coming from. And so a speculative pragmatism, which is what I'm building out of, is really that what it says. It's pragmatic. How is this happening now? Everything, like give it as much detail as you can. It looks like this, it feels like this, it moves like this, and so on. But what else does it carry? That's the speculative part. What else is with it that doesn't know how to be itself in the world, that carries qualities? So that's where the virtual, in terms of the question of gesture, you're absolutely right. In the book that I wrote, Relationscapes, I talked about pre-acceleration, and there's a really interesting thinker at the Paris 8 who talks, Hubert Godard, who talks about pré-mouvement. And I should tell you, for any francophones, that the minor gesture has been translated into French, and I can send you French if you prefer. I didn't know about pré-mouvement until after I had written Relationscapes. I think the difference between pré-mouvement and pré-accélération is this question of the virtual. So for Hubert Godard, it's really in the actual. He's really kinesthetically understanding how the muscles are activating in the body before the body displaces itself. So there's a shift in the body that is perhaps not noticeable except in the micro movements of the body. And that's really important research. What I'm saying is, yes, that, plus there's a quality in which movement is altered by the environment in which it resides. And I can just tell you that every mover knows this. They might not know it as pre-acceleration, but they know it. They know that there's an incredible difference between moving in a studio where you've practiced to another space. So you're like, oh, my movement is weird here. Where do I find it? Singers know this. The way that the sound comes on the walls and comes back to them, and then the way it changes. So my feeling is that whatever word you have to articulate this, I called it pre-acceleration because I needed to find a way to create value in those spaces that are never given value. There's incredible knowledge in those pre-accelerations, and they give the quality to a movement or the quality to a sound. In a band, if you listen to the shift of solos from, whether it's classical or not, you feel the pre-accelerations, you feel this kind of wave of a kind of listening and moving together. And so anyway, that's what I'm trying to get at. And in those waves, where are the minor gestures? Are there any? Is really what I'm asking.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Marco, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I don't want to generate more conversation. So, because I know we're at the end of our predetermined time, but at least in the spirit of excess, I'll offer something. I'm trying to think through your predicament a bit, Erin, and this notion of movement. Movement takes you somewhere, right? But there's an aspect or dimension of your situation which involves a stillness, and I wonder if we could conceive of that in practical terms, by which I mean in terms of a practice, along the lines of the yogic asanas, where the actualization or the consciousness, the experience is in the still. It's a dynamic stillness, right? You're holding a pose, and you're breathing, hopefully, into it or with it or in it. And that pose could be construed as a gesture in a sense too. And of course, within that pose, there are all kinds of activities. And as somebody that is, I don't want to say starting or initiating, but really like moving an organization or an institution into being, bringing it forth in some way, in this particular in between space. I find that to be very interesting because in my, for me, it's almost almost the flip side of a coin, where I could very well be in your place. And if I'd made certain different decisions in my life, I would be, I think. And I'm really appreciating this opportunity to talk, because part of what I chose to, I say I chose to, I'll just put that in quotes, to forego was the opportunity when I chose not to go into academia or to leave it, as on the verge of going from undergrad to grad and looking at the options in my life. I have missed that the kind of collegiality, the kinds of the intellectual stimulation, the whole life of an intellectual, of a student, and of study. I've missed it for so long, and what I've realized is something that has been happening for me is the attempt to recreate it outside of the borders that I exiled myself from when I chose to leave. And then, of course, I could have gone back, but then being a bit older and having a family and looking at the economic, it just made absolutely no sense. Yeah. But then what did make sense? Nothing actually made sense. None of the options made sense for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that has, there's a cost associated with any decision, right? There's opportunity costs, economically speaking, but there's existential, profound existential costs. And I wonder if, and I wonder if we are, and if we can affirm even the legitimacy of having it both ways. And that freedom aspect, like we might imagine that there's some field beyond the institution or beyond the constraints of our social regimes, and I believe there are actually,
right.
But what I think most drawing from the material I read is rethinking where freedom really is or can be. And I think maybe that's part of the tremulous sort of skin that we're on here, this space here. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, I mean, a quick response. I really hear you when you talk about the asanas. I think I'm very influenced by Spinoza, who talks all about movement and rest. Movement is part of my work on movement over the years, or part of the reason I did so much work and continue to do so much work on movement, is that there's a tendency in the philosophical world to only focus on displacement. And I'm much more interested in what I think of as intensive movement. So that in between that you talk about, that is actually probably not lived well in most yoga studios, because of the focus on the movement displacement, and the tensions between the valuing of different kinds of practices. I mean, I think the yoga world suffers for that, because there's a desire for fitness, which is not necessarily at the heart of yoga, right? It could
an eye-actualizing kind of...
Oh, totally. I mean, I left yoga after many years because I just couldn't stand it anymore. But the yoga I left was not yoga. I mean, it was whatever. It's a cultural phenomenon. But I have a great yoga wall in my studio, and I can do it alone. But I think the other question is really, really important. I guess all I would say to that is about half of the SenseLab are non-students. So when I said before, maybe we're already doing it, the reason I said that is that a lot of people have chosen to work without being in an accredited university. So over the past decade, we've created a network of people you can study with without having to pay fees. And we've done that so that people who want to just be in university without getting degrees can. What is really noticeable in a classroom is that those people who are not getting it for a degree tend to be the hardest workers. They tend to have families and jobs, but they take the time and they make the time. And sometimes the students in the classes get angry with me. And I say to them, you should feel shitty about the fact that you're going into debt and not doing your work, and these people aren't going into debt and doing their work. Like, we should be talking about this. We should be talking about the debt economy and what we feel its promises. Like, are we here to build a debt economy? Or are we here to learn? And if we're here to learn, then my opinion on your learning shouldn't be so important, for example. So also, I think that I was talking about this with my mother yesterday, because, if you complain about academia, people always take you down, always, right? Like you're in the perfect place and you don't know what you've got and all that shit. And then there are so many people who aren't getting jobs. And if you're a full professor, then you're even worse, you know. I get that. But I do think it's up to some of us to push what else learning could be. And so it's really that ethos that makes me do the work of the Three Ecologies Institute, not so much because I'm trying to suggest that there's something better. There's lots of betters all over the place. It's more that I want to recognize that these alternative forms of learning are happening all over the world. I meet them all the time. I meet people all the time who are learning outside of academic contexts in really exciting ways. But who are often unsure of the value of their knowledge. And I am really kind of undone by the thought that people would put the academic stamp as the value of knowledge. So there's got to be a way to do that is in no way stopping people from learning. I mean, I would never want to keep anybody from a university, but isn't identifying the university as the only place we can learn. And in the mix of all of that is kind of complicated by the fact that I really want the hard learning. Like I don't want this kind of anti-intellectual crap. That's not what I'm interested in. I want to spend hours reading a hard philosophical book too, you know. So I want the love of learning to be hard, but not to be not to destroy the value, which I think it does in a lot of university systems, where the students become less and less risk taking. They become more and more organized according to the matrices of value that are imposed.
I think it's a promising moment, actually, for this. And the connection with Holochain, for example, the idea of decentralized networks, which, you know, still, you know, allow for organization. It's still, you know, it's not chaos. The different kind of economies that I think are in play there. And the thinking too, and with the Holochain folks, this is like a spin-off from two different projects. One is called Scepter, and the one prior to that, or the kind of meta project, mother project, is called Meta Currencies.
Yeah.
And the idea is to track many different kinds of value.
Exactly.
Currencies of value. And so I'm really glad we've had this conversation, and that it will continue.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm sorry if I could just say, maybe I shouldn't. Yeah, I won't. I'll hold it. Yeah.
We can write in the forum our responses that we may not have been able to generate in this conversation.
Well, I just want to appreciate, because I was a good student, and that was like the fact that I was good at school was what I've had to most overcome in my adult life. And it took, you know, major crises in my early 20s, you know, in the transition, deciding what to do, deciding, am I going to keep doing this? Or am I going to follow a different path, which was very unknown, but spoke to me, called. And we're homeschooling our daughters now because I just couldn't subject them to what I feel I went through. And I didn't even know I was going through until way after the fact, till after the, you know, the kind of mishandling of the potential. Like at the risk of sounding extremely narcissistic, like I think that, and I would extend this evaluation to really anyone here. Like, I think I'm brilliant. I think I have so much more within me than really had the space, really was recognized in the environments in which I grew up. And not because of my parents necessarily, because they really were subject to many of the same forces. Yeah. And so opening up spaces where that, you know, that withinness of, you know, that welling of genius that otherwise I think really gets completely suppressed, ignored. That's such, I really appreciate that work. So thank you, Erin. And I'll stop there. but I wanted to share at least that personal sort of, you know,
May I have 10 seconds?
Sure, Doug, I knew you've been wanting to speak.
I like your haircut, Doug.
Thank you.
Great
it's very,
haircut.
very manly. But I just want to say my original metaphor has been extended, the undercover agent. Now I see it, maybe all of us can be an undercover agent, but I see myself as an undercover agent uncovering agencement.
Oh, nice.
And that's really all I want to say there. If I can maybe extend it 10 more seconds, going off this space, but in my office, once my other office mates leave from about 1 to 4, I lock the doors, I shut out the lights, and I get my laptop out and I run. I hold the book in hand, I'm running, I'm pacing, and that's how I best learn. And perhaps I have autistic tendencies. I'm noticing the light changes, at least with Erin and I, and things like that. So like Marco and everyone here is saying, there's another world to be grasped out there. So
yeah,
this
I
has been
love
a
that
great
image.
conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you.
I'm going to finish up with a reading, just to, this is from the last page of the introduction. Minor gestures operate at this cusp where the non-conscious and the conscious co-compose, where language operates beneath the words, as autistic Amelia, formerly Amanda Baggs, might say. From this position of indeterminacy, of the ineffable, how to make intelligible the singularity of what cannot be measured or categorized, but is felt, and in some sense, known. And I read that without the question mark, but I wanted to finish on the question mark.
Thank
So
you, Geoffrey.
thank you everyone for your participation. Erin, it's been a huge pleasure to have you here and to work with you again in this context.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you.
I hope to come down to Montreal soon, and we'll get together and do something in Montreal.
Super. Thank you so much for your generosity, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Next time.
For the readers, the next time in 2 weeks, and we're going to do just chapter 1 because it's a big chapter. And I think we just need to focus on that one chapter. And it's also the first, I mean, the introduction was pretty substantive already, but the first chapter with the density to it. So it'll be just that one chapter, and then we'll go on to the other chapters later. So
Thank you, Geoffrey, as well.
thank you, everyone.
Next time. Thank you.